Hi everyone, here is my lecture for you on participatory research. So I'm going to begin by just talking a little bit about research generally. Then I'll talk about the specific nature of participatory research. And then I'll illustrate participatory research through a project that I've been running for the last couple of years. So just a quick recap, right, on the nature of research generally, right? So the question here is, what is research? And these are some of the things which characterize research. And I've taken these from Peter Clough and Kathy Nuttbrand's book, A Student's Guide to Methodology, which is a great place to start on this sort of thing. So research is firstly purposeful, right? It's an investigation or an inquiry, but it's purposeful. There is some good reason to do it, right? So it must have some sort of purpose. The investigation or the inquiry is systematic and it is rigorous. And what that means is that it is methodical and it is thorough. And I will come back to explain how I made sure, how we made sure that the project that I was involved in or am involved in, it fulfills these criteria. So research is a purposeful investigation, which is systematic and rigorous. And then a reminder also of the purpose of research. So why do we bother to do research in the first place? And when we ask this question, often people's first response is, well, it's to find stuff out, right? We do research to find stuff out. As indicated by the word discovery on this slide. We want to discover things that we didn't know before. But with much, if not most research, it's important to realize that it doesn't stop there, right? Research is not just about finding stuff out, right? It goes further than that. So once we've found something out, once we've discovered something, we want to do something with what we've discovered. We want to put it to work in the world. And there are various ways in which we might do that. So we might use the findings from our research to generate new ideas and theories, in other words, to enhance our understanding of the world. We might use what we find to solve a problem that's important, and that might indeed be the purpose right behind the investigation to start with. We might put our findings to work in influencing policy and practice, around education, around inclusion, around disability in our case. And perhaps what unites all of these things is a sense that we want to change things for the better. So I think it's important to realize that research is about making change happen, right? We want to make the world a better place, and research is one way that we can do that. Now, on to participatory research. What makes participatory research distinctive is that it is collaborative. In other words, a range of people, in our case, disabled people, participate in the research. So with most academic research, you tend to have, a lone scholar, right, a lone academic researcher, or perhaps a team of researchers working, individually on their projects. They might go out and, generate or collect data from disabled people in some way, through a survey or a questionnaire or interviews or something like that. But it's not really a collaborative. It's very much the researchers' project, then driving the whole process, and usually then benefiting from the process. So most research on disability is research on disabled people rather than with or for disabled people. So what's distinctive about participatory research is that it is research by and with disabled people rather than on disabled people. So in other words, disabled people participate in various steps of the research project. The research project is about things that interest them, things that matter to them. And the research puts their views and knowledge sort of front and center rather than privileging the viewpoint of the academic. So Dan Goodley, Professor Dan Goodley, whose work you may have come across before, or if not, you certainly will in Level H, talks about the fact that disabled people are an over-researched group, and yet much of that research has disabled people as its object. In other words, as the kind of object under study, it objectifies disabled people, rather than disabled people being the people who drive the research. And that's what's distinctive about participatory research, right? Disabled people are really at the heart of it and driving it. On at least an equal footing with academic researchers, if academic researchers are involved. And participatory research aligns very well with the goals of the social model, which are obviously about identifying and then attempting to address and remove barriers to inclusion in education and in society more broadly. And participatory research, the way it's been developed and evolved does tie in with the development of disability studies itself as a discipline. So a lot of disabled people and disabled scholars have been critical of the way that most research about disability is done. So Mike Oliver, right, whose name you'll know, from the origins of the social model. Mike Oliver talked about these kinds of approaches being there to resist what he called tourists and tarmac professors. So in other words, those academics that kind of steamroller over disabled people in pursuit of their own careers. So there's a perception and a danger that much research just contributes to the continued oppression of disabled people, right, through this kind of steamrolling over them and exploiting them for what they can give to the researcher, rather than it being for the benefit of disabled people. So I'll give you a little for instance. So just yesterday, I was listening to a podcast with a PhD student in California who was developing a robot guide dog. And the interviewer asked him, to what extent disabled people had been involved, or blind people had been involved in testing this guide dog, robot guide dog. And the researcher said, well, they haven't, right? We've just had non-disabled people putting masks on. And obviously the interviewer, who was blind himself, wasn't very happy about that, and then made the point that, well, a lot of times people like you and scientists and doctors come up with these kind of interventions. They say they're great, but then they don't actually work, right, for the people they're supposed to benefit. And he was asking the inventor of the robot guide dog how he was going to address that, and he didn't really have an answer. But that's the kind of thing where the research is often more for the benefit of the researcher and their career rather than disabled people themselves. So that's one reason to do participatory research, for the benefit of disabled people rather than researchers. And the second reason, or a second reason, is that participatory research and what we can also call inclusive research, two names for the same thing, basically, is that it's in fact good research, right? It meets the criteria for good research, and that's what we'll talk about now. So here we have some criteria for what makes for good inclusive research. These, again, have been generated by some very well-known disability and SEN researchers, Jane Seal and Melanie Nind. I'm not sure of Parsons' first name, but these people are very well respected in inclusive research circles and participatory research circles. So here are the criteria, right? So good inclusive research answers important questions we could not otherwise answer. It gets access to something in ways that we could not otherwise get. Thirdly, it makes critical use of insider cultural knowledge. Fourthly, it's authentic. In other words, people recognize it as valuable, worthwhile, meaningful research. And fifthly, it has impact. In other words, it makes a difference to people's lives. And you can, I hope, see the connection there to the purposes of research that we talked about at the start in terms of discovery, inquiry, and making change, right? Making the world a better place somehow. And so now we've talked about what research is, we've talked about the purpose of research, we've talked about the nature of participatory research and good research. Now that we've covered all that, I'll talk a little bit about one research project I've been involved with that used a participatory approach. So the project was called Getting Inside Histories of Learning Disability. So this was a project that I was involved in, and two groups of researchers who are people with learning disabilities were also participating as co-researchers. So this was one group of co-researchers at the Brain Charity, which is in Liverpool, down near Lime Street Station. And another group of co-researchers working at the University of South Wales. And so this was a participatory project around the history of learning disability. And we were using archive material, so material in a digital archive, very old and quite rare medical textbooks, to investigate together both the history of learning disability, and particularly how people with learning disabilities were represented and conceptualized back in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and how conceptualizations of learning disability back then related to experiences of learning disability now. So it was about understanding learning disability in the past, and it was about how that relates to experiences of learning disability in the present. So the way that we did that was we accessed material in the digital archive and one particular book, and we found a case history of one person in that book, a lady called Antonia Grandoni, who lived between 1840 and 1870, 1830, sorry, 1870, and spent much of her life in hospital because she was diagnosed as a microcephalic idiot, which is a diagnosis that we would now call a diagnosis of learning disability. In the book, there's a case history, her case history, and also a couple of portraits. And so we systematically analysed her case history. You can see perhaps in the picture there's some paper clipped together sheets of white paper, right? That's her life history broken down into paragraphs, and you can also perhaps see her portrait, right, down at the front of the image there. There's a profile portrait of her. You can see a group of people sat around the table talking about and writing about on bits of flip chart paper Antonia. So we had a series of prompts and we analysed paragraph by paragraph Antonia's life story, and then talked about Antonia's life story, and people related it to their own experiences today of learning disability. So this was purposeful in the sense that it was about finding out how people with learning disabilities were thought about and treated and talked about back in history, and how that compares with the experience of learning disability today. And it was systematic and it was rigorous, because we worked step by step, very methodically, through the various aspects of Antonia's story, and then had sort of structured conversations to relate her story to experiences of learning disability today. And that, I think, helped us to fulfill the criteria for good inclusive research. So we answered, because we had those insider perspectives on the archive material and on learning disability, we were able to answer questions about the historical representation and treatment of people with learning disabilities and the experience of learning disability today that we would not otherwise have been able to answer. Right, so I, as an academic, couldn't have answered those questions myself. It needed participation from learning disabled people. We got two kinds of access that we wouldn't have otherwise got. So the researchers with learning disabilities got access to the archive material, which they wouldn't have otherwise got without the involvement of myself as an academic. But we all got access to each other's knowledge and experience of learning disability. So we all benefited from these two kinds of access through participation. The whole project was about making use of insider and cultural knowledge. So it was people with learning disabilities and their advocates and their family members who were doing the analysis and talking about their own experiences, their insight and their cultural knowledge. So the whole project was about number 3 there. And it was definitely authentic because the people involved recognized this as worthwhile and important research. It meant something to them, it had meaning for them, it was important to them. And importantly, it led on to number 5, impact. It made change happen. So people who participated in the project, they talked about being able to do things that they hadn't been able to do before. So in other words, they were able to now do research. And in fact, a number of them went on to now participate in a project about the impact of COVID-19 on learning disabled people. So people felt more confident in themselves. They were able to do things that they were not able to do before. They became able to do things they were not able to do before. We also presented together conference papers, so people helped to write and present big important academic conferences. We did a public event as part of Being Human, which is the National Festival of the Humanities that happens every year, big, major national event. And so we had a public impact there. We educated people, the public, about the history of learning disability and the experience of learning disability today. We have a project website which has had several thousand views, so that's had an influence on people as well. So there are a number of ways in which this participatory project has made a difference both to the people involved and to the general public. So I think it's reasonable to say that we've done a fair job in meeting a lot of the criteria for good research through taking this participatory approach. Now, it does have to be acknowledged that although participatory research is perhaps the most desirable way of doing research with disability, about disability and with disabled people, it does present some very significant challenges that anybody considering it needs to be aware of. So the first one is quite common actually for any research that involves working with people, and that's getting access to collaborators or participants in the first place. It's, disabled people are an over-research group. They might be fed up of being asked to be involved in projects or have been involved in projects before that didn't really benefit them. People don't generally want to undertake research or get involved in projects where they don't know the researcher or what's involved. So just getting access to participants can be the first and the biggest obstacle. So unless you have good contacts and networks, then it's very challenging to get access. But good things happen if you do pull it off. There are always challenges around ethics, particularly in this case. People with learning disabilities are often considered vulnerable, and so ethics committees can be very wary of these kinds of approaches. But you can, of course, make the case that people who are disabled shouldn't be considered vulnerable. But nevertheless, that's one of the main ethical concerns. Also have to make sure that people obviously understand what they're getting involved in, that they give fully informed consent to what they're participating in, and we have to take steps to ensure that happens. Explaining the project and the purpose of the project, the nature of people's involvement, what the likely outcomes are, in ways that people can make sense of. There's a perennial problem, the third one on the list here, a perennial problem around the degree of participation or the degree of control that disabled people actually have over the project. So, full participation would probably be considered the most desirable position. So in other words, the project is initiated by disabled people and driven by them throughout. That is, though, very difficult to achieve. So, for example, a lot of people outside of academia don't have access to the kinds of resources and knowledge and networks that enable research to be done. So in the History of Learning Disability project, I began the project. I actually got some grant money to run the project and to work with the archive material. So I sort of dreamed up and designed the project, and then had to go and find learning disabled people to be involved in it. So I, initially dreamt up and then designed the project, and then the participants only became involved a little way down the line. But once they were involved, they were fully involved, as I say, in deciding on the methods, in doing the analysis, in, as I said, writing conference papers, and we're now collaborating on writing a scholarly paper, a journal article together. So there's a fair degree of participation and control, but not total participation. And that's always a tricky balance to find. Okay, the fourth one here, the fourth challenge is that any research which involves a lot of people becomes time-consuming and complex. There's no getting away from that, really, right? It is a significant investment of time, and obviously the more people that get involved, the longer things tend to take. So you have to be ready for that and take account of it. And the final challenge that I've put on the screen here is the emotional one. So a lot of the stories that we recounted and heard in our project about learning disability were quite harrowing. So, for instance, one of the co-researchers was telling us about her experiences of electroconvulsive therapy, about rape, about some pretty horrible things that doctors and psychologists have done, right? And that's, that is hard going, right? So there is a significant emotional involvement in a project like this that you have to be as ready as you can for. That said, there is a flip side to that, which is that actually, despite those harrowing stories which came out sometimes, a lot of other times we had a lot of fun, right? It was a really enjoyable process to work together on something. We all learned a lot from each other, and we learned a lot about learning disability through taking this approach. And fun isn't a word that we often associate with research, I don't think. So I guess that's a bit of a plus to finish on. So final slide, we've got a project website there that you can investigate. And I've also put a link on to the archive that we use. That's freely accessible, freely open to the public, the UK Medical Heritage Library. So I'd encourage you to explore those two, as well as the further reading there, if you're interested. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. Thanks for listening. See you soon.